So we've had some wines in this machine now for 8 days, so that's quite a long time to open a white wine and to leave it exposed to air. So if this machine works, then these wines should be tasting quite fresh. If it doesn't work, then they should be tasting quite oxidized by now, because 8 days, like I say, is a long time. The first one we're going to try is a Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough in New Zealand. It's a 2009 vintage from a producer called Ant Moore. And this sort of style of wine is the perfect style of wine that really does need preserving. So it's the kind of wine that really needs a machine like this. These wines are fresh, young, very vibrant. You know, they want to capture all that youth in them. So we're going to pour ourselves a 50 centilitre measure. Okay, so the first thing that I would look for with a wine like that is, as a white wine gets old, it literally starts to rust and it starts to oxidize, and what happens is that it loses a lot of that very light, very fresh green color to it, and it starts to go more golden and amber in color. So that would be the first thing that I would look for with a wine like that I knew was open for this long. But looking at that wine is kind of classic colour for a Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. So very pale, almost water white, and a touch of green to it. So that green is indicating that young, fresh character has still been captured. So we'll have a smell. Again, very typical style of Marlborough, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So very pungent on the nose, lots of characteristics like gooseberries, nettles, asparagus, sort of kind of a slaty mineral kind of character on the nose as well to it. Smells like a very young, fresh wine. So after being open for that period of time, you know, smelling good. With Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand as well, you get this enormous amount of acidity to it, and this very sort of fresh characteristic that comes through as kind of lemons, limes, really sort of fresh and very bright, very young. And all that's pretty much been captured. So this wine is tasting very fresh. For something that's been open for 8 days, that's pretty good going. Very classic style, very delicious. The next wine that we're going to try is 2009 Chardonnay from the Pays d'Oc in the south of France from a producer called Bellefontaine. So again, the first thing that I'm going to look for on this wine is really the colour. And it's looking quite young, quite bright, quite fresh. Chardonnay tends to take on a little bit more colour than Sauvignon Blanc, especially if it's been barrel aged. So this has a bit more depth to it, a bit more of a yellow characteristic to it, but that's pretty normal, I would say. So on the nose, this kind of wine doesn't have a lot of new oak to it, so you're not getting much of that sort of vanilla and that butter and that sort of toasted popcorn caramel kind of character that you get from barrel aged wines, but it has got a richness to it. It's got a different characteristic to the Sauvignon Blanc. It's a bit riper fruit, maybe a bit more peach, stone fruit, passion fruit, maybe some apricot, so slightly more tropical, slightly more richer textural, and it's texturally on the nose as well. But again, that style of wine, 2009, very young, very fresh, should be drunk young, not a wine to age for a long period of time, drinking perfectly at the moment. Again, all that youth that has been captured, very bright, very fresh, great acidity to it, very long length, slightly kind of that stone fruit character coming through, again that peach apricot characteristic coming through, so nice wine. Right, so let's move on. We're going to move on to a Pinot Noir from the New World again, so an Australian Pinot Noir, a 2009 Pinot Noir from Pemberton in Western Australia, so right over on the far side of the west. So quite a cool area, great for making Pinot Noir. You have a lot of those sort of ocean influences that cool all that coast down, so light varieties like Pinot Noir are perfect for that area. So, 2009 Fontes Pool from Australia. It's looking good, it's looking like a Pinot Noir. It should be quite pale, should be quite light for a red wine. Should be able to see straight through it. I can actually see on that, I can see a little bit of CO2 which has still been captured in the wine, which is pretty good. So it means that that wine, even though it's been open for 8 days, it's still got a lot of those kind of principal characteristics that it had when it was bottled. So a lot of the time in screw cap, they tend to put a little squirt of nitrogen in just to kind of keep the oxygen off the wine and stop it maturing rapidly. And having those bubbles coming out the glass from a bottle that's been open for 8 days is a very good sign. It's been preserved very well. So on the nose, typical Pinot Noir, kind of very ripe, very rich cherry, raspberry kind of character to it. A little bit of sort of earthy, meaty kind of character, almost like sort of roasted bacon fat, that sort of character, animal sort of characteristic to it. Some caramel to it. Again, tasting very fresh. Well, yeah, that's a nice Pinot Noir. That's a nice soft Pinot Noir. That's a bit more like a southern Burgundy Pinot Noir from the Côte de Beaune rather than heavier style from the Côte de Nuit. It's a very soft, very bright fruit to it. Almost has some cranberry, some strawberry, and that raspberry cherry characteristic coming through again. Nice bit of oak that rounds off the palate and gives it that nice caramel and that meaty characteristic to it. Very soft tannins to it. Quite high acidity. So yeah, preserved perfectly well and tasting really good. So moving on to the last wine that we're going to try today. This is a 2007 Syrah from the south of France, so from the Pays d'Oc, similar to the area where the Chardonnay came from. So a much deeper coloured red wine, almost kind of black in the centre, and then fading out to a lovely kind of garnet ruby rim. So these wines, southern France Syrah, should be big, meaty, full-bodied, heavy styles of wine with lots of blackberry, blackcurrant, dark chocolate, some really meaty, spicy, almost peppery characteristics to it. And this has got all of that. Touch of new oak to it as well, sort of giving it a bit more complexity. A big, chunky, beefy style of wine. And a lovely kind of sweetness to the palate as well, that blackberry fruit and that kind of blackcurrant fruit, almost like jam, so very hot down there. So that red wine is really kind of getting a real sort of baked characteristic to it, almost very jammy, very ripe, sort of sweet fruit to it. Again, with the delicious acidity, which is very bright, very fresh. Again, showing that this machine is really capturing that acidity, because that's one of the first things to go with a wine that is open for a few days. The acidity starts to drop, the brightness and the freshness of the fruit starts to die away a little bit, but this is kind of really showing very well. And 2007, starting to take on a bit of that complex tertiary characteristics that give it that slightly animal and gamey character. So very good. Yeah, so I think overall, I think concerns with wine that's been open for a long time is the oxidation characteristic. As soon as you open a bottle of wine and you release the closure on it, oxygen starts to go in and it starts to degrade the quality of the wine. And like I say, the first thing that starts to go is that bright, fresh fruit. The acidity starts to drop, and the whole fruit of the wine starts to taste a lot more flat and a lot more bland. Everything that I've tasted today is really showing a lot of youthful characteristic to it. So I think the machines work very well. And what I really like is the temperature on the red wines, which is fantastic. Often you find much too much red wine is served far too warm. And if you have red wine sitting on a bar back or in the back of a restaurant, in a busy restaurant where it's quite warm, the wines are too hot and they get very soupy and the alcohol slicks out and they're kind of not pleasant at all. The old thing about serving wines at room temperature is from many, many years ago, before they had central heating. But this kind of machine is really kind of keeping those wines at a very good ambient temperature, really cellar temperature, which is what you want to serve them at, kind of around about 15, 16 degrees. So especially for the Pinot Noirs, very good. So very impressed.